she's staring at.
This is Catacomb 3D, released in 1991 by Softus Publishing and developed by id Software, or rather the folks who would form id Software and develop those other 3D games you may have heard of. As a matter of fact, Catacomb 3D is the immediate precursor to the game that would set the world on fire, Wolfenstein 3D, which would be the precursor to the game that dragged the world to hell and back. Yep, that's a Doom clip. But we're not talking about any of those. Instead, we're talking about Catacomb 3D, which you could get nowadays on GOG.com as part of the Catacomb pack, which includes the two 2D Catacomb games we looked at previously, as well as 3 other Catacomb games made by entirely different people, and are much different games that we're not going to be looking at anytime soon. Oh, and also John Romero is selling a big boxed version of Catacomb 3D if you want to get that. Anyway, Catacomb 3D, as the title would suggest, is the 3D version of the Catacomb, the overhead shooter thing that we looked at previously, and thus operates along the same premise. You control a wizard named Johnny, Peyton, Petton, Billy, Catacomb Guy, whatever, and you have to navigate 20 levels of the labyrinthian catacomb, slaying monsters with your magical chargeable fireballs, collecting keys to open locked doors, which now come in a variety of colors, blasting walls in hopes of unveiling hidden passages and secret rooms full of treasure, and uncovering inventory items such as healing potions, lightning and nuke spells, and magical scrolls in an effort to find the exit to the next level, where you can do the whole thing all over again in a new setting. Catacomb 3D lets you save your progress up to 5 or 6 slots, I believe, and you can load your game from the last point you saved in, like the modern day save state. And if you're tired of navigating catacombs, there's a little Pong game you could play against a computer. Or not, it's your choice. Imagine a world where the greatest thing to come out of the id Software house was a new innovative take on table tennis. Thankfully, we don't live in that world, but I digress. Catacomb 3D is best described as a more primitive version of the later success story that is Wolfenstein 3D, which is stating the obvious, but sometimes the obvious is enough to get the point across. In terms of gameplay, it's relatively simplistic. You move around with the arrow keys or a mouse, no WASD to be found here, and you activate your various items to the first letter of each spell. So if you want to use a healing potion, you press the H key, nuke spells, you press the N key, and even though this is a primitive FPS, it's still an FPS, which means keyboard and mouse control is an option, so you can use the mouse for aiming and shooting with the left mouse button and holding down right for strafing. And control, unsurprisingly, works well enough. Not quite as slick as a more modern day setup, but it serves our needs here just fine. Catacomb 3D boasts 20 levels of play, with each level following a similar premise. Some levels will introduce new monsters for you to tackle, new colored keys and doors, and some scrolls to provide you with some helpful information, but it's always working towards the goal of finding the exit to the next level. That is until you eventually reach one level that serves as a hub for multiple levels, which is where you'll find clues on where and how to access the final set of levels, which will eventually lead you to a final encounter with the evil being called Nemesis. It's also by this point where Catacomb 3D starts to lose a bit of steam, as the sameness of each level starts to become apparent and the feeling of tedium slowly sets in. Granted, with a built-in save feature, nobody's forcing you to one-shot this entire game, that would be silly, but even in short bursts, Catacomb shows very little in the way of variety, both in terms of level design and gameplay. You may have a limited inventory system of sorts, but outside of the healing potions and very limited situations where you might need a lightning spell or something, you'll mostly be using your main fireball weapon, which can be charged for a stronger shot by holding down the fire button and has unlimited ammunition. But unlike in later id games where you eventually gain new weapons to combat hordes of monsters, you're always using the same fireball attack from beginning to end. Thus there's no real sense of growth and progression. The gameplay is very simplistic, and for what it's worth, it is functional, it's not broken or anything. It's a perfectly playable game. I mean, considering the people behind the scenes, why wouldn't it be? But while simplistic gameplay of this sort might work for a more faster-paced overhead shooter, it doesn't work quite as well in the less speedy first-person setup like Catacomb 3D. I don't know, maybe you added in a couple more Nazis, Pitten would have been more of a rush to kill these fuckers, but I guess we're saving those for the next 3D game. Anywho, Catacomb 3D used EGA graphics, which meant a far more limited color palette compared to the later VGA, so it's safe to say that this is not the prettiest looking game you'll come across, but even so, you can see hints of greatness with the 3D aspect. You move around smoothly, scaling and turning is pretty slick, there's some variety in wall textures even if it's ever so slight. I mean, it's easy to say that it looks ancient nowadays, but back in 1991 or whatever, this was mind-blowing stuff even with 16 colors of awesomeness. I do like the little descriptors for each of the little rooms that you visit, and I also like how your health is represented by your hero's pasty mug slowly degrading into a skull. It almost reminds me of the old Spider-Man game from Paragon Software, which featured a Spider-Man figure slowly degrading into a skeletal remnant as you're losing health. Honestly, that's a better fate for Spider-Man than anything that happened to him since One More Day, but I digress. Catacomb 3D is the first game in the Catacomb series to feature music. Mind you, it's only one song, it's a short loop, and it's not all that great to be honest, but it is something. And there's also digitized sound effects that make use of sound cards. They also sound somewhat lackluster, but again, baby steps. We'll get some slick audio soon enough with later games. Of course, you have the option to disable both of these and replace them with more appropriate music or something. I don't know, I could take it or leave it. Mostly leave it. Overall, Catacomb 3D is a fascinating look into the early days of an eventual gaming giant, but one that won't hold your interest for very long. On paper, it succeeds in being a 3D version of the old Catacomb 2D game, but whereas the older game was much quicker paced due to the overhead style, this one plays a little slower and that probably hurts the game a little bit. That and the general simplicity of the gameplay in general and the monotony of the levels means that some folks are going to play a few rounds before they get bored with it and move on to something else. Like those other 3 Catacomb games that were made by other people and feature slightly deeper gameplay. Or you know, that other later game with 3D in the title. You know, the one with the Nazis. Anyway, Catacomb 3D is a vintage title that's definitely a product of its time, certainly worth a look as a curiosity piece of historical artifacts and maybe for the sake of nostalgia, if you had fond memories of this game once upon a time, but beyond that, you're not really missing out on anything special. But hey, Romero's selling a box set with stuff in it, so that has to count for something, right? Right? That's right, good night.